This is part 1 of 2 of our conversation with Philippa Rees. Welcome to SkyBlue Symposia, a convivial gathering for stimulating conversation and a free interchange of ideas. Today, Philippa Rees has been kind enough to join us for a new symposium as we continue consciously exploring. Philippa and listeners, I am so glad you could join us. I am Sibel and I will be your host. Susan and Schipper will be joining us on this roundtable. We invited Philippa today because she has written a truly unique book, Involution and Odyssey Reconciling Science to God. She balances the artistic right brain and the logical left brain by presenting her work in a combination of poetry cantos and in scientific and historical footnotes. Reading the poetry sections gives you an almost emotional, spiritual body understanding of her message. You'll feel this treat for yourself when she reads us some of her work. Philippa has a multicultural background from South Africa to the U.S. to Europe. She was an academic before her mystical experience. She will be sharing with us some of her journey and how she integrated these diverse experiences. Welcome, Philippa.
Thank you very much, Sibel.
We're so happy to have you with us.
Well, it's great fun to do this because it forces me to really realize what the problems of putting across this book may look like initially, and try and solve them in company of easy people, even if they are amateurs. Makes it much easier for me.
There you go. There you go. Well, could you tell us a little bit about yourself? Your book is not an ordinary book, and so you have an extraordinary outlook. How did your life contribute to that?
I would say that probably not a single facet of my life was irrelevant, but I've only come to really understand that in recent years. To start with, I thought that the experiences that prompted the book had come out of the blue, and in one sense they had. But now I realize that, in a way, the entirety of my life was the soil in which that seed was planted. And the significance of every single thing that ever happened in my life contributed to why it happened. And I think, more importantly, what it contributed to being able to write the book in the way that I have. I was never going to be a specialist, but I'll get back to the very origins of my life. I was born as an only child, virtually fatherless. My father and mother separated before I was 2, so I never knew him. And my mother was very young, only 20, and I was the impediment that prevented her from going to medical school, which was the dream of her life. And so as soon as she could, I was put in boarding school when I was 5. All the other children were 12. And so I was forced to be an exceedingly independent thinker from a very early age. And that sounds very cruel in some ways, but there was a counterside to that, inasmuch as my grandparents were quite extraordinary people, and they looked after me in the holidays. So my source of richness and impoverishment were, in a way, two sides of a single coin. And the interesting thing about my grandparents is that they were not at all typical of South Africa. I'm sure you're all aware that South Africa in the 40s, which is when it was completely divided between the Boer and British encampments and the hostility between them and the political difficulties. Well, my grandmother was half British and half Boer, so we always straddled the divide. And my grandfather was English originally, but utterly fluent in 2 African languages, Swahili and Zulu. So I grew up in a country in which these areas never really related to each other, but right within my own family and the household I grew up in, there was always the need to realize that both sides of the question needed consideration and needed loyalty and needed faithfulness. And added to that, when I was 6, a most wonderful thing happened. An African woman called Mildred Toko Indaba knocked at my mother's door and said she was looking for work. And my mother just pulled her through the door and gave her the keys and left for the day to go to work herself as a physiotherapist. And Millie stayed in our lives until about 5 years ago. So my mother and Millie, my black and white mother, lived together the entirety of my life. So I had a very unrepresentative childhood and life in South Africa as a completely atypical South African. And I now realize that that was the source of enormous richness in terms of the necessity to understand that there were always two sides of an issue, and never to feel that loyalty to one was a betrayal of the other. So, in a sense, a book that reconciles science and religion is something that, in a way, you can see the roots of in all the other divided loyalties that I had to face as a child. In addition to those things, I was very fortunate, although I was very solitary. My grandfather did the most wonderful thing on Christmas morning, woke me up at 6 o'clock when I was about 9 and said, "Come and see your present." And there was a horse saddled at the gate. And that was in Lesotho, where horses were the only form of transport. And so I had the entire country given to me on Christmas morning. And that also was some illustration of my family's gift for incredible generosity. They had no money, but they did have generosity. And the generosity was to give me the liberty of independence, even though I was very, very young. And that independence, I suppose, stood me in great good stead when it came to having to face the consequences of the first edition of Involution, which we'll probably come to later. So that's something of my sort of background and the things that fed into it.
Well, what a gift. I mean, a gift to have such a diverse childhood, and it sounds like you really had to learn to think for yourself as well.
Completely, yes,
Yeah.
I did.
Yeah.
But I was loved. I was never doubted that I was loved, but my grandparents were very independent-minded, and they saw independence as the greatest strength that they could offer. And in that, I think they were right.
Yeah. So, what triggered you to write Involution, an Odyssey Reconciling Science to God?
Well, this is quite a difficult one to approach in that order, but I think I'll just grab the question boldly and just simply admit that I was visited by a mystical experience which turned my life inside out. And at the time it happened, it appeared to come out of the blue, but it wasn't very long before I realized that almost everything had been established to make it possible and to make it likely to happen, although I was unaware of those steps that were being taken towards it. By the time it happened, I was married. I had 2 very small children. My husband and I had spent some time, he was an academic, a marine biologist, and we were attached to the University of Miami, but we'd spent a year in Germany at the Max Planck Institute with Konrad Lorenz. And suddenly, out of the blue, a letter arrived just before we were due to return to Miami, offering us a use of a house while we looked for a house of our own. Now, the person who wrote that letter, we'd never met. And we were very grateful because we had nowhere to go when we returned back. So it was absolutely providential. And when we arrived back in Miami, the house was there. There were car keys on the table. And he had left a note saying, "Help yourself to the house and the car." And we never met him, and we found a house to buy ourselves. So we didn't meet him then. And the thing that triggered the experience that I'm about to recount to you was we invited this man and his wife to dinner just to thank them for their incredible generosity to us. And in the course of this dinner, he started talking, this stranger, about the nature of matter and the structure of matter and how it was nothing but Chinese boxes, one packed within the other. Now, I can't describe sitting in a Florida evening outside what happened, except to say that I knew that something incredibly vital had changed in my entire concept of reality. Something so deep rang within me that I hardly noticed this couple disappearing. The man left before his wife. She stayed and talked to my husband for a bit. I was mesmerized and stayed in the garden all night. And the next morning, his wife came and said, "My husband's left me." And I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "He says he's in love with you and he's left me." And she was in tears. And I said, "Well, this is quite absurd. You know, something very odd has happened here, but he'll be back, I'm sure." And she said, "Oh, yes, I wouldn't be worried if he'd slept with you, but because he's left without further word, I am worried." Anyway, what then started to happen is wherever I went, I ran into this man. If I took my children to the park, he'd be on a bench. If I took them to the dentist, he'd be outside. A series of coincidences far beyond the probable. It happened every day. And it seemed as though we were being drawn together for some purpose. It was inexorable, the sense of the force that was behind this. And it was not an affair. I wasn't in love with him. It was just realizing that there was some penetration of ordinary life that was happening, that had started on that evening of the dinner, that was never going to let us alone. And it seemed as though we were being drawn together for some purpose. It was inexorable, the sense of the force that was behind this. And it was not an affair. I wasn't in love with him. It was just realizing that there was some penetration of ordinary life that was happening, that had started on that evening of the dinner, that was never going to let us alone. And because my husband started being facetious about it, and I knew that this was something so serious, so dramatic, that I had to give it time, that in the end I went away for a night with this man who I scarcely knew. And we went to Key West, which was quite significant because it's the furthest extreme point we could have gone in the United States. And we spent the night together, and in the morning we walked in onto the beach in the dawn. And it was breathtakingly quiet, and the sea was still and quite spectacularly beautiful. And suddenly, I looked at him, and his face just fractured as though it was painted on glass. And it moved to the side, and so did the entire landscape. I couldn't see anything. There was no sea, no sky, just light. And into this light loomed this incredible eye, a single eye, a luminous eye. And it just hung and looked. And then I heard his voice, and he said, "Can you see it too? Describe it to me." So I did. We described to each other what we were both looking at that wasn't there. And as soon as we'd ascertained that it was the same vision, it slowly evaporated back. And after that, the landscape returned as though painted on glass.
So you weren't seeing each other's eyes, you were seeing an eye in light?
No, that's right. We weren't seeing each other at all. There was nothing else when the eye was there.
Wow.
It was just light and the eye. But after the eye gave us time to verify it and disappeared slowly, then the landscape returned. So Plato's cave came back, and he moved into vision, and he came back, and I came back for him. Now, it's very difficult at this point to tell you, but I'm sure you're beginning to see what this signified. If you'd had that experience alone, time would have inevitably dimmed it. You would have thought this couldn't have happened. I was deluded. It was a bizarre occurrence, but didn't have significance. Every single thing had taken us to that point, and it had been going on for weeks. And after that point, there was no way we could escape what had happened, because for me, it changed the entire way I looked at the world. And I realized that consciousness was not a product of mind or brain, rather, not mind. It wasn't a product of brain, because a vision that is shared with someone else can't be a product of both your brains and be identical. So instantly I realized that the brain did not emit consciousness. And I suppose initially that was the first thing that it really struck me. Now, I had a science degree, which I didn't mention earlier, so I had accepted the scientific view of the world that everybody else did, and I suddenly realized that it was entirely inadequate. I was not a religious person, and I hadn't read about mysticism, and I hadn't read about how many experiences of this kind people had reported through the centuries, because that was never my interest. I had had an interest in theology, academic theology, when I was at school, but that kind of, how shall one say, almost undeniable experience had to be assimilated. But having said that, it destroyed all the outer trappings of my life. My husband thought I was off my mind. He divorced me. I was in America on an academic visa, so I couldn't stay in the country because I lost my right to be there. So in the end, I arrived in England with 2 children and £5 after a divorce, and that vision had taken pretty well everything with it. Now, the interesting thing about this, and it took a very, very long time, is that it was as though it had propped open Pandora's box, and the things that then followed it, the experiences that proceeded to follow it, were sometimes celestial, sometimes infernal, but what they all showed me was what I would come to call the relativity of experience. And depending on the state of consciousness, the experience of time changes. And what increasingly happened is that I only had to think of something, and it was there. I had to think of a question, it was answered. So the instantaneity and synchronicity of life took over completely. Now, just in parenthesis for talking to you, I noticed that one of the speakers on your program that's due to come is Christopher Bach. Have you spoken to him yet?
Yes, yes.
Well, when some years ago, when I got the first draft of the book out, I wrote to him because I'd read his Dark Night, Early Dawn, which was the closest thing I'd ever read to what I had experienced. And I asked him to look at Involution, but he said he was just too tied up and too busy. But we exchanged enough for him to say to me, I'm amazed you could come back from that experience, because very few people do. He said, I did it differently. I was under controlled, drug-induced, guided sessions, protected. For you to actually live in the world with children and survive it was quite extraordinary. So that brings me to the first draft of Involution. And I thought that I was writing a new scientific thesis called Involution. I now realize, and it's only 44 years later because it's taken that long to rewrite it, I now realize that the first Involution was my ladder down, my ladder back to intellectual sanity. Because what I was experiencing in that post mystical period was unfiltered consciousness. There were no filters. Mind and matter, thought, event were all in one field instantly. And yet, curiously enough, I never thought I was insane, because I learned instinctively to navigate, which is the word I'd use, navigate through this process. And I then began to realize that I had understood this possibly in a previous life, but I had a kind of instinctive understanding of how this layered levels of consciousness interacted with each other. And that if I didn't allow myself to fear, I couldn't afford fear, because fear was paralyzing. But in order not to fear, because some things were quite terrifying, I developed a strategy of falling. And I'm sure you're aware that a child is born with only one fear, and that is the fear of falling. If you hold a baby and you sort of let it feel as though it's dropping, it panics and it thrusts its arms out. Falling is the deepest fear, which I now realize has to do with dying and our experience and memory of dying. And I discovered in navigating through this incredible buzzing confusion of timeless existence that if I didn't fear anything, then I would learn a completely safe way through it. And so the strategy I developed was to let myself fall. And the minute I let myself fall, all fear would go. So it was like using the deepest fear to cleanse all fear. Anyway, to get back to involution, so I then wrote Involution, the original theory of involution, because I knew that only I could get back from that world to the ordinary world of human life and to my children and my responsibilities and so forth.
Well, my goodness. Just that bit about recognizing that consciousness can't be in your mind if both of you are seeing the same thing really caught me. And then what a bold, fantastic person to have made this journey with your bravery. Yeah.
I don't honestly think, Sibel, that I had much choice in the matter, because I recognized it was such a phenomenal, I mean, I haven't conveyed in remembering it for you the glory of it, realizing that you are part of something so immense, so vital, and so significant as to be offered the gift of the vision of it. How could you turn away from it? You know, how could you just go back to putting supper on the table and say, oh, well, that was interesting. There was no way I could have run away from it. And I think that it would have been, I never felt harsh towards my husband because I knew he couldn't understand it. And indeed, for many years, many people couldn't understand it. And when I came to England and I was befriended by the most wonderful couple, because I brought the first theory of involution as a monograph. It's all I had. I hoped it would get me access to a library to rewrite it or to an academic world, because I had come from an academic world, though not a very high-flying one. And I was befriended by a wonderful couple, and his name was Dick Milford, and he'd been Chancellor of Lincoln, and he was a great follower of Teilhard de Chardin, and so he understood what I told him. Sorry, David, you were going to speak.
Actually, it was me. This is Susan Philippa. I'm just in, I think, awe listening to you. I perfectly understand when you speak about something happens, you trust it, you cannot turn away, it's glorious. And I think that it's so important that we do trust these experiences and not question ourselves and embrace the awe that comes to us in these wonderful gifts. But Philippa, I had another question based on something that you mentioned. You said you were able to see the steps that led to your mystical experience. How would you describe those steps?
I think what I would say, and this really only came to me later when I started to read what other mystics had experienced, and what very often their experiences were more deliberate and more sought. But you see, I'd grown up with my mother as a single mother who said to me, if anything she had emphasized was, you never ever betray a marriage, because she had been desperately betrayed by my father. So I grew up with this complete given that the greatest crime you could commit would be to betray a marriage. And on my wedding night, I went back the next day and I knew I'd made a catastrophic mistake. And my mother was very brisk and said, well, my girl, you've made your bed, you have to lie on it. She was totally unsympathetic. And I grew up believing that that was the ultimate necessity. And so when I met this man in the way that I had, who'd come out of the blue, what was I to think? And yet it was, so in a sense I was being invited to walk away, leave all that thou hadst, and follow me. So this was almost biblical. But for me, the greatest thing I was leaving was the thing that I'd been most indoctrinated about, i.e. the
Yes.
faithfulness to marriage. So that was one of the contributing steps.
Yeah, that's not your particular instance there. But it does seem that we have to face our greatest fear and find the courage somehow to break through that. And then once we do, it's like a test or something, and then that makes us available.
Absolutely. I would completely concur with that. I mean, because at one point, I lost my children too. I had no way of supporting them in England, so I had to leave them with my first husband. And he proposed to strip me of them. And in the end, I realized I couldn't live without them, but I had to live without them for a while. And I lost my children, my country, my home, my mother's good opinion, the good opinion of all my neighbors. I lost everything. And the loss of everything made me available in the way that I described. So in a way, those were the steps that you asked about.
Yes. I completely concur that is the process, and in the process we have to trust. And somehow the courage comes and it doesn't even feel like a loss. And there you go. Philippa, why is your book written in Cantos? Why did it come about?
Why is it written in poetry?
Yes.
Well, there are a lot of reasons, and some are macro reasons and some are micro reasons. But before I get on to them, I want really just to clarify one thing, that in a way, the book is not what it appears to be. What it appears to be is a history of science to present an alternative theory of involution rather than evolution. And yes, there is a skeleton, and that is there. But the book is far more, the best way I can describe it is it's a scaffolding in order to permit the inspection of another building altogether, which is the Cathedral of Consciousness. So what I am trying to say is that science and the facts of science, the chronology of science, is the scaffolding to afford access to a vision of the Cathedral of Consciousness, which is simply cloaked by science. And if the book is accepted, and I think there are people who will see exactly what it's doing, once the premises of the book are understood, then the scaffolding of science will come down and it will be viewed entirely differently. So from the point of view of poetry, you have to look at how could one maintain a vision of the cathedral without the scaffolding getting in the way. If I'd written it as prose, I'd have had to defend every statement with supportive facts, supportive evidence, and the scaffolding would have got very solid indeed, and all the book being about would be another theory, another solid scientific theory. Now, there are so many books that written as solid scientific theories. Ken Wilber does a better job than I could ever manage. Irvin Laszlo, likewise. There are countless books these days on the new holistic science. What I wanted to enable a reader to follow was realizing that I am writing a book about memory, and every single person reading this book has a memory, and they are all part of the same memory. So by using poetry, I could allude to something which we all share in common, but the particulars of which, the colors of which, the synesthesia of which, the reader could add for themselves. So by enabling the reader to do that, I'm actually inviting the reader to take the Odyssey of science in order to discover that science is simply a mythology. It's another mythology. It's a good one, but it's just another mythology. So by writing it as in poetic cantos with two characters, reason and soul, reason takes the thread, the rosary of science, soul takes the rosary of art and music, And together they intertwine and present the DNA molecule, which is the history of science. But what is really important is that the kundalini up this middle of between these two spirals, the kundalini of genius, of inspiration, is threaded right up the middle. And it moves from the early inspirations of the pre-Socratic Greeks, Parmenides, Empedocles, and people like that, up through the scientists and the artists and the Michelangelos and the Beethovens and the Mozarts, all of which are revealing this incremental recovery by man of his own memory. And the reason we've got to where we have now is because we have almost penetrated totally to the beginning of time, which of course we've got hadron colliders smashing matter and all the rest of it.
So it's like the veil of unremembering is being removed at this moment.
Yes, absolutely.
And it's through particular individuals that might have a greater attunement, do you think? Or is it just the luck of the draw? Or why do Mozart's or Van Gogh's or anybody get the glimpse? How is it that the genius comes through?
Well, one of the things that made me realize that this pattern, this mirror that science has of creation, if you look at it, there's a diagram in the book, but there's a complete mirror between the creative narrowing and ascendancy and convergence to man and the penetration of memory by science. And this mirror is what gave me the the decision, really, that I had to look at what genius was. And what I found was that genius in science or art or music had complete parallels with the great religious inspirations. The saints and the scientists are eating from the same bread. And what it seems to me is very clear is the kind of personality that is susceptible to inspiration is someone immersed and soaked in a kind of passionate quest. It could be a scientific quest, or it could be a musical quest, or it could be a religious one. But their appetite for uncovering truth, I think also courage comes into it. They tend to be individuals who don't swim in the mainstream and who don't accept orthodox opinions very easily. They tend also not to be very narrowly focused. They tend to be broader, so therefore, in a way, they're open. How it's expressed once they've experienced it will depend on the things they do have. In my case, I had a very broad education across a great range of disciplines, but not a very specific one. So it enabled me to see the whole of science with a kind of egalitarianism. In a case of a Mozart, he was steeped in music, so he expressed it musically. And if you look at the difference between Mozart and Beethoven, Mozart, it almost came through untouched. He hardly changed a note in a score, whereas Beethoven really had to struggle. So I think the language in which these geniuses express themselves will vary according to their natural gifts and talents. But the vision comes to a particular kind of person. And I honestly I wouldn't claim that I am built of the normal stuff, because I don't think I was an obvious sort of genius in that sense. I think I was given this gift. And it has been at the back of my life and the back burner of my life, the whole of my life. And it wasn't until, I'm 72 now, it wasn't until I realized that time was running out and the faculties were no longer quite as sharp as they once were, that I thought, I've got to do something creative with this. I can't leave without leaving a legacy from it.
Oh, that is beautiful. Go ahead, Chipper.
I just wanted to read something that I just found while looking up the term involution, and this is from Sri Aurobindo, and the quote is, "The reason for involution is delight, the delight of being, the spirit, were absolute, moving to delight of becoming, temporal existence, the cosmos. Being throws itself forward into a multiplicity of forms, becoming lost in the inconscience of matter, and then through evolution it partakes in the delight of rediscovering the spirit which had been hidden in the interim. And I think that's exactly what you just said. The flavor that you are expressing right now is the description of the language of those touched by this vision. It's just exhilarating to listen to you. Thank you.
Well, I'm a great fan of Aurobindo's. I only discovered him about 10 years ago, and he lives by my bed. Uh-huh. And I find whenever I lose focus to some extent, I just open Aurobindo and I read whatever page I open at, and he is just quite magnificent, I think. But what is very interesting in another section of, I don't know which Aurobindo you're reading, but I've got The Adventure of Consciousness, and in one section he talks about tantric poetry, and he quotes, because he was very fluent in French, and more fluent in French perhaps, but he quotes the sound of Rimbaud's poetry, and the point he makes is that you don't even need to know the meaning. Uh-huh. It is just the sound of the words that conveys a level of consciousness. And it was rather inhibiting reading Aurobindo and writing Involution, because I was aware that some lines began to match up, but an awful lot of them didn't, and it was quite a sort of challenge to keep going, because I had to temper the poetry to the narrative. Yes. Because in a way I had to take the reader through the odyssey of scientific and musical evolution without losing the sense of something numinous and wonderful behind it. But I still had to temper it, as I'm sure you realize, David, to some kind of narrative thread.
Well, we think in stories. We tell ourselves stories every day, and that's what is most approachable to us, it seems, unless we've been touched by this, whatever this touching consists of, that you have been party to. I have been trying to read Savitri, Aurobindo's epic poem, for 30 years, so I can understand just picking up and reading something by him.
How have you found Savitri?
It is so diaphanous to me. It is such a difference from a daily state to delve into that, to go in there and to feel the emotion that is informing the words choice that he's putting together is an experience in itself.
Because I've never managed to get a copy, but I've read quotes from it. So the interesting thing is that a number of the quotes, the diaphanous quality that you describe is exactly what I would have said. So I was interested to know how a long reading of a long section, which I've never had, struck you.
Yes. Again, that tendency to curve is embedded so deeply in that poem, and I have a resonance to that curving, that Fibonacci curve, I call it, that golden mean bending of the spiral. But like I say, diaphanous fits real well for me on that, because I couldn't keep a linear thought going to save my life when I jump into that.
Well, this is one of the things that I've had a certain reluctance with about Involution, is that I had to temper my desire to be more free poetically with the narrative, because what I suppose I was hoping to do is to give the reader a view of where we've come from and what we've come through, but without obscuring something much deeper, which of course Aurobindo is only concerned with, the greater depth. and mine is relatively more superficial than that, and I'm very aware of it.
Well, I was thinking about why I write poetry, and it is an exclaiming outward of that delight. It's I find it difficult to keep it in when I'm involved with that motion, but I understand the superficiality, because you just can't go there with words. You know, it requires an investment on the person hearing the words or speaking the words to themselves, because to read some of that silently does it such disservice because of the way the tongue wants to dance to it.
Absolutely. I mean, it's very interesting you brought this up, because literally, I don't know if Sibel had told you, this week I'd had a guest blog on somebody who guessed the Undercover soundtrack, and she asked me to contribute an account of how music has shaped my writing. And most of the people who contribute to this talk about characters and the music of the times, and, you know, whether it's sort of urban rock or what have you. And for me, music is actually the challenge I try and attain in words, and I try and get as close. So for me, music is the hardest taskmaster of all, and it's never very forgiving, because nothing I can write can come anywhere near doing what Beethoven can do in 3 bars.
Yes.
But I still aspire to get near to that.
Thank you. Yeah, I think you more than adequately approach that.
Oh, David, thank you very much.
This is Sibel again, and could you describe in a little more detail what involution means to you?
Involution is really a very simple concept, and it comes from that experience I've described to you. If consciousness is not in the brain of man, then consciousness must exist throughout the universe. So from that, I started looking at the contemporary understanding in the religious disciplines of what consciousness, God, soul all meant. But getting straight to involution, the theory of involution has 3 or 4 interconnected premises that are really very simple. It is that matter is the informed consciousness. The consciousness informs the shape and structure of matter. As a result of that, matter becomes increasingly self-deterministic. Because consciousness is within it, it acts spontaneously. That action creates memory. That increases consciousness, and so it goes. So the incremental informing of matter by consciousness exists right throughout the structure of matter, from the molecules right up to the brain of the human being. And that is encoded as memory. So in the sense, DNA encodes the memory of evolution. Once you get to man, what Teilhard de Chardin called man knowing that he knows, you are dealing with a new level of involution, but it's involution all the same, whereby incrementally the memory that is now encoded in every cell of every human being and right through the biosphere is interconnected memory. And science is the incremental recovery of that memory. So the inspirations of science are the incremental recovery of what we already know, which gets right back to, of course, Plotinus and Plato. All knowledge is remembering. You only know by identity. All the standard texts of mysticism are now being ascertained by involution. And in a way, that's, in a sense, reintroduces the idea of divine purpose into the creation. It's not the divinity of a manipulative divinity organizing things from cloud 9. It is the emergent divinity that is co-created with the creation. The two are inextricably mixed. So the mystical experience that one encounters is the immersion of oneself in the whole, which is the soul of the universe. And this is the point at which we, as individuals, become the cells of that soul.
Oh, that's lovely. And I think many people have the experience of when you discover something or learn something and you get it, the feeling is recognition.
Yes, absolutely. And you know it's absolutely right. You know perfectly well that you can't question it and quibble with it because there aren't two possibilities. And that is one of the most distinguishing marks of the genius, the eureka moments of genius, is that every single experience of this will ascertain that they just knew that it was right. They didn't know how they knew. Sometimes, I mean, Lamartine said, "I've had my answers for a long time. I still have yet to find the questions." So it's a reversal of the usual, the deductive reasoning of the intellect. The certainty from consciousness comes as a whole, which is the syntheses that genius is known for. So that science is normally an oscillation between thesis, antithesis, is it this, is it that, let's refine it. Oh, no, it's got to be a synthesis. And the great steps forward in science have always been those amalgamations of syntheses of genius. And that is the hallmark of genius, being able to suddenly bind two contrary opinions in one.
So can you give some distinctions of the difference between evolution and involution? Because they have overlaps, but where do they differ?
Well, what I would say is that evolution describes the outer casing of consciousness. Evolution describes basically the world of matter and the way in which DNA shapes the changes in the world of matter. Up until recently, it was considered almost accidental and almost errors of replication in DNA. Now, with epigenetic inheritance and the fact that DNA is changed, but for a long time with Darwin, it was never believed that DNA could be changed. It was only the means of changing other things, and accidents and replication errors resulted in advantages which were then conserved. What involution is saying is that consciousness is the dominant and driving force. So that for me, the act of the individual, when you think about it, natural selection, which is supposed to select the most adapted of the species in order to foster its promulgation, how does natural selection decide which is most adapted unless the creature acts in some way? And that action endows it with that advantage, which causes it to survive, to breed, what have you. Now, that action may look fortuitous, but that fortuitousness may indeed be the reflection of consciousness spontaneously acting. And that the other distinction with evolution is that action and experience changes DNA. So unlike evolution, where DNA is, as it were, in the driving seat and matter follows DNA's instruction, what involution claims is that the experience of the individual changes the DNA, which stores that change as memory. And not only in the creature that has the experience, but right throughout the biosphere, because what is science is now discovering is that any change is changed throughout. The butterfly wing, in Minnesota will change the weather in somewhere else. This has now become Mandelbrot's chaos theory has now become accepted in science, that anything that changes everything. So a change in one creature changes the entire information web of DNA.
Oh, thank you. That's lovely. Then could you give us an overview of your book, a brief synopsis of the Cantos?
Sure. Essentially, the book starts, Canto the First is a kind of broad overview of the evolutionary journey we're about to take. And it reminds the reader of the traditions of epic poetry, of Homer, of Dante, and so forth, and why I'm embarking on doing this yet again. And then Canto the First sets out the entire map of the journey. It talks about the past traditions of religious revelation and the gulf that starts to open up between rational and intuitive understanding. And then it sort of demonstrates that the early theories of science were always shaped by an idea of perfection. The early scientists were always looking for the perfection. So there was always deep in the human consciousness, in the first recordings, a religious sense that the universe had religious significance. And this went on right through science throughout, that from Kepler, Copernicus, Galileo onwards, all these people were looking for perfection, and their models were always perfection. And that goes right to the root of the earliest scientific thought. So Canto the First sets out the map and those tracks. Canto the Second, which is called Memory, Dreams and Separation, deals much more with the constants, the oscillation between positive and negative, the complexity arising through synthesis that takes it up, and the inner selection rather than natural selection, the inner selection that shapes the decisions and the growth of the natural world. And then we get on to Canto the Third, which is the earliest days, which starts on the Serengeti plain with the emergence of early man. And that's one thing where my education was very relevant, insofar as one of the greatest paleontologists who found the first human remains on the Serengeti plains was Professor Raymond Dart, and he was my professor of anatomy at university. So that was just the only sort of orthodox academic influence I can claim, really. So in Canto the Third, we see early man beginning to puzzle about where he fits and realizing that he is not, we're talking probably Neanderthal hominids, that his curiosity and the manipulative power of his hands, his opposable thumbs, his diet, his bipedalism which develops, has now freed the mind to grow. From Canto the Fourth onwards, we get into the sort of accepted records from Greece, early Greece, pre-Socratic Greece. So now we take the chronology of science to demonstrate the mirror that science gives and the way in which it emerges as it's required to describe the world that became the world of science. So we see the recorded time, the early ideas, the fertile genius of Parmenides, until we get to Plato and Aristotle. And once we get to Plato and Aristotle, we're starting with the great divide that remains constant until relatively recently. The reason that the Interlude, which is Archimedes and Alexandria, takes what I call the hinge of the argument is because I felt by this time the reader needed a break. But more importantly, I wanted to give the reader a reminder to remember that this is only scaffolding I'm dealing with. Please come with me, let's climb it together, but don't think this is what the book's about. And the section on Archimedes and Alexandria actually is an analysis of the limits of intellectual endeavor as the path to truth. It's just a quick reminder that this isn't the point at which you stop remembering that this is what the book's about. So then after they've had a break, and then no footnotes to Archimedes, so they don't have to look up any science, we get on to Canto the Fifth, and which is the Dark Ages, and the monasteries and the Muslim contribution to the scientific world and the preservation of the Greek sources. Because what I was keen to demonstrate is that everything is retained in memory. Or the Greek sources continue, even though the Dark Ages appear to forget them, the Muslims preserve them, and so too does the early Christian church, and the Islamic world of chemistry and mathematics was critically important to that. We get to Canto the Sixth, which is the Renaissance and the liberty and the sudden explosive energy once the Renaissance hits us, with Queen Elizabeth on the throne, the concurrent developments, and also, interestingly enough, the separation of the geology in Britain, the anatomy and perspective, the exhibits of diversity are national at this point. Different nations seem to concentrate on different disciplines. And then we get to Descartes starting to define exactly what mind and matter's distinctions are. And at this point, we start to get very entrenched between the division between mind and matter, And we're now preparing, obviously, for Newton and all that. And so when we get to Canto the Seventh and we're into the Enlightenment and rationality, mind and matter, since Descartes, are completely separated from each other. And we see single thinkers taking hold of different scientific disciplines and taking the machine of creation apart. And we've got the chemists and the biochemists and the physicists and so forth. And we're now dealing with only the outer world. And this goes back to your earlier question, how does involution differ from evolution? We're now dealing firmly with the evolutionary world leading up to Darwin. And by the time we get to Darwin, we're dealing with what he observes on the outside of himself, which bears no relation whatsoever to any imagination about the inside at all. So after the seventh, we get to Canto the Eighth, which is the beginning of the dissolution of matter. Once we get... I set this back on the Serengeti because I wanted that image of Kilimanjaro, that perfect conical mountain with its ice cap on the top, which is where man began. I wanted that image to remain with the reader while we look at the ice cap on the top dissolving, as matter dissolves, as fields take Faraday and Clerk Maxwell. Everything dissolves into fields of energy. Matter becomes nothing but energy. And we've got back, involution has taken us right the way back to where we began, on the Kilimanjaro slopes. And to make it very economical, there's a section in Canto the Eighth in which I just simply describe magnetism and electricity and the gradual unification between them, which ends up being Heisenberg's principle of indeterminacy, Einstein's arguments, and they oscillate. I give them a dance to dance. They start being quite separate, and then there were the syntheses in the middle, and then they separate off into opposites, and then they synthesize again until we end up with quantum theory and relativity, which is the field of everything in creation, now entirely reunited. So then we're left with the final one. We've got to the separation of intellect from consciousness. Intellect has modeled the world that is inside, but they think it's entirely on the outside. And this has been the remaining difficulty of being unable to reconcile relativity and quantum theory, because the concept is that matter is external to ourselves, instead of realizing that we are part of a field and we are part of a field of consciousness, and there is no separation between consciousness and matter. It is all consciousness. We only perceive it as external because we've agreed to that. That has been the history. We've only seen time as moving in one direction, if you think about it, if the future was always the past, we are recovering memory, then the future was also simultaneously creating the present. But we only ever perceive one half, which is the past, not the two working together in the moment of now. So at the end of Canto the Eighth, we've now dealt with the whole realm of science, the dissolution of matter with Einstein and Heisenberg and Niels Bohr and the structure of the atom. It's all gone. And what is left is only, for me, at this point, to try and demonstrate that all these great achievements were people who were prepared to immerse themselves and to experience the mystical experience, the perennial experience. So the last canto is only narrated by soul. All the others have been a dialogue between reason and soul, but at the last one, only soul speaks and invites the reader to enter the experience itself of love, and then to re-experience that love has always been at the root of science. And that, of course, explains to you why this book has not been easily published, because the scientists don't yet feel ready to accept their dependence on the subjective experience of love.
That's changing. That's changing so rapidly these last
few years. It is, David.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And it's interesting you lay the part of that onto Aristotle. That's just a synchronicity for me. Thank you. Would you read that section on Archimedes?
Absolutely.
On which this book is hinging. I think it would be just so marvelous to hear your own voice speaking the words that you saw and translated.
With pleasure. I should just indicate that Reason and Soul are heading off for Rome, and Reason is rather fed up about this because she's quite happy in Alexandria, or rather happy in Greece, and doesn't see any reason to go and pursue the Roman legions. So really the excuse, Archimedes did live in Syracuse and did go to Alexandria a lot, so there is a strong basis of truth in the historical fact of this poem, but the actual relationships, to some extent, are there's certain poetic liberty taken with them. All right?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. This is called Interlude.
You could almost regard it as the hinge of the argument. Essentially, this book is trying to propose that there are many ways to knowledge, and that the academic, studious, theoretical way to knowledge is offset or contrasted by an alternative, which is the knowledge that comes from love. And the interlude is introduced at a point where I think the reader needs to be reminded of that. Perhaps he's been stretched by what precedes it, but essentially this interlude is the nub of the argument that the book overall is presenting. Interlude, Archimedes and Alexandria. A compromise is hereby proffered in answer to your deep desire to visit in the dying days remnant Athens drawn to Alex. We'll travel to Sicily, a fertile isle with vineyards, goats, and rough red wine. With Haron we will sojourn well. It's said he keeps a tethered squire. In his garden there resides a venerable, much more than Bede, as Haydn was to Esterhazy, a constant stream of world renown, servant in name, but in truth the jewel in unsullied crown. So Archimedes serves that suit for Haron, he just thinks his thought. On the outskirts of the town, between the buttresses all clothed in oleander and dense shade from carob trees, he will be found. They say plaintive goats bleat through his day, white pigeons scratch his modest ground. His simple bench he occupies from dawn to dusk, tracing circles in the sand, making notes and diagrams upon papyrus sheets, procured when in Egypt he devised a screw ingeniously raising water from the river's sluggish bed. Sluice arteries swift now irrigate the planted banks on either side. Shall I lead the way? Who shall I say? He is recluse. He'll need a reason to interrupt his mental fast. Tell him we visit from the future, not tourists through his memories, sand sifters of a different sort, with things perhaps we might impart. Visitors? I receive no visits now. Bid them depart. Say I am old, or, if you will, no longer sensible. Where are they bound? To Rome. Tell them to tarry in the town. Rome is on its way to burn us out. Such visits weary. What's in a name? They'll nibble raisin detail, but tear the wholesome loaf, all sweetmeats bruised by questioning. What do I recall of Apollonius? Well named for God. Will he appear at even, lissom, on a rock, bronzed by the setting sun, his chest a quiver, ribs all laced with indrawn breath? A moment later the ebbing sea enfolding him, its meniscus thick with molten gold. But they will ask, what did he leave? What conquer? What import did his calculations hold? Ellipses, parabolas, hyperbolas of talk will drown my precious vision of the boy. Tell us of Eratosthenes instead. Was he not curator in your day? Did he not put a girdle round the earth? Was it not his sieve of mind that shook out the succession of the primes, pierced the sphere on which he stood, with an axis, pole to pole, round which he moved? Was not the equator what he named, imagination's scalpel that incised the globe? If you know the substance of his muse, why ask? Why are you wasting time? Eratosthenes, my friend, how desolate your absence proves. Remember how I ran through all those swarming streets, My slave was burdened like a beast, so I might leap the library steps to your high eyrie in the roof. Yes, well, I might have travelled through the realms, my continents of troubled thought. Yes, yes, raised water from the river's bed, swung the earth around my head, moved the pyramids to tilt upon a fulcrum, and submerged floating bodies, displaced weight, seen planets circumscribe the sun. Yet none of this answered the still, small voice that whispered, "What is a man? Why has he come? To fathom out all that he is, but not know what he thirsts to find." That alone I received, in small inflections from a hand, quizzical amusement in a brow, a surreptitious fleeting smile, the shaking of an honest head, the synchrony of walking pace in the presence of a friend. A friend is not reducible, as are ideas mechanical. What did we choose in one another? What drew the bond? Distance was in fact enhanced. The adventures found in solitude seasoned parting, and renewed rich sources for a new meal shared. Therein lies answer, yet I full know it will not prove amenable, entire and too delicate for intellect's analysis. The heart has its reasons inchoate. What do I know? Or know I knew? I knew Eratosthenes. Make my excuses, bid them refresh at Arethusa's gushing spring. Aeschylus is between his draughts, he may give what I cannot. To him is audience meat and drink. I do best in solitude.
This completes part 1 of 2 of our conversation with Philippa Rees.